The .NET Core podcast is supported by our listeners who have become patrons. To see a full list of the patrons, or to join them, head over to dotnetcore.show/patrons. Hello everyone and welcome to the .NET Core podcast. The only podcast which is devoted to .NET Core, ASP.NET Core, EF Core, Signal, and not forgetting the .NET Core community itself. I am your host, Jamie Gaprockman-Taylor, and this is episode 50, Elasticsearch and Open Source with Martijn Laarman. In this episode I interviewed Martijn about his contributions towards open source projects, some of the ways that open source can be incredibly useful, and about his work on the .NET client for Elasticsearch. So let's sit back, open up a terminal, type in .NET New Podcast, and let the show begin. So the first thing I'd like to say, Martijn, is it Martijn or is it Martin?
I accept any form of my name, but it's the proper pronunciation is Martijn.
Martijn, okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, I will try and use that from this point onwards then. I'm really bad at pronouncing names. You give me something Japanese to read out and I'm your man, but I can't, most of the Western European names I kind of fall over on the pronunciation because I don't have that education in most of the those Western European languages, you see. So.
All right, I'm not fussy at all, so feel free to mispronounce it throughout this podcast. That's fine.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you ever so much, Martijn, for taking the time out. And it's during the workday. Usually these recordings happen kind of late into the evening, and I usually thank folks for spending part of their evening with me. But it's part of the early afternoon. So thank you ever so much for spending your afternoon with me.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I do hope to chat a bit about Elasticsearch. And I work for Elastic that makes Elasticsearch. So I guess this qualifies as working. So, but either way, we are fully remote, and in charge of our own hours. So I guess even if it wasn't about Elasticsearch, or I would have probably still done it in the afternoon.
Okay, well, what we'll do is we'll just tell your boss that you just talked about Elasticsearch for 45 minutes.
All right, if you can sign off on that one, then that'd be great.
Absolutely. Send the paperwork over after the recording.
Will do.
So for the folks who may not know too much about the work that you do, could you give us a brief introduction to yourself and a little bit of background knowledge? Maybe, we've heard already that you work for Elasticsearch, and we'll come on to that in a minute, but how did you get to there? What's Martijn all about?
What am I all about? Wow, big question. I work for Elastic, as I mentioned before, and I'm in charge of the clients, all the clients for Elastic. So not just the .NET one, but also the other languages that we support. But I started off at Elastic right as the .NET client person for Elasticsearch. And I've always done development. I started developing when I was 17. Started working professionally from 17 onwards, and mainly in web development. And I've always done big data projects as well. And so naturally, this led me to discover Lucene, Solar, and as soon as Elasticsearch poked its head up, I started working on the client. I think 2 months after Shai, the original author of Elasticsearch, wrote the first version of it. So then ever since I've been working on that client, and it's almost 10 years in the making now. So it's kind of weird to work on the same open source project for 10 years. And I'm always a little bit apologetic because I feel like it should have been done by now. But at the same time, things are moving fast. And so that's why we're still working on it. Everything's evolving. And I've always done open source projects, whether in .NET or previously JavaScript or you name it. I try to do as much open source work as I can.
I do like long-term projects, open source or closed source, because I think it was only a few weeks ago I was reading an article about, I think it was React or something similar to that, one of the many millions of JavaScript frameworks, and how there are very few projects that have lived and breathed in this one particular framework for more than 2 or 3 years, and how we're starting around the time of Angular, React, Docker, all of these frameworks just sort of popped up seemingly out of nowhere, but out of a lot of people have put lots of effort into creating them. But very few projects have actually lived past the 5 or 6 year standard support lifecycle before they've been trashed and started, well, not trashed, but been rewritten from the ground up. And I think that's maybe something that we're going to have to deal with in the next 10 years is all of these legacy applications written in frameworks that were sort of almost created, well, feel like they were released to the public overnight, that have no support in them, and people are just going to have to become experts, which is why I prefer to work with libraries, open source or closed source, that have been around for a long time, regardless of whether they are in the done state or not, because, what is done?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think .NET has quite a different culture in that regard than many other ecosystems where most of the libraries in .NET have been around for many years, and the developers tend to stick with them for quite some time, which is in many ways, I think, a blessing for the .NET ecosystem, that a lot of the big, I would say from the top 10 NuGet packages, a lot of them continue to be supported through everybody's hard work. I don't know if things will change in the future, but yeah, it's always disheartening to find an NPM package that you like, but then the last commit was 4 years ago, and then how do you evaluate that? Is that still a good package? Is it done and dusted? It's hard to evaluate those things.
Yeah, I agree completely. As someone who creates and maintains a number of open source projects, it's disheartening, like you say, to go, oh, brilliant, there's a NuGet package which does all of the majority of this chunk of functionality I'm trying to create. And then, like you say, you go have a look at the NuGet package, you go have a look at GitHub or wherever it's sourced from, and the last build, not even the last commit, but the last build was a number of years ago. And you start to worry about, well, is it maintained? Is it finished, like you said? Or are there bugs? If there are bugs and someone hasn't worked on it for 4 years, what are the chances of someone replying to a bug report?
Yeah, exactly. So it's quite hard to evaluate packages, because there's also like a bit of a survivorship bias where the package that keeps getting updated might get popular just because it's keeps on being the most recent one, even though another package might be actually better for your purpose, but has just stopped development 4 years ago. It's interesting to see in the .NET ecosystem what that will do in the long run. I don't know if we'll ever adopt the same culture as Node.js, where packages are pushed very fast and abandoned very fast as well, but I hope to see that in .NET more. I'd rather have too many options to choose from than too few options to choose from.
I totally understand you. In any kind of business, it's always better to have options, because let's say I want to try and use something that's not software development related. Let's say you walk down the street and there are 5 restaurants to choose from. That's probably better for you as a consumer and for them as businesses. For you as the consumer, you get a choice of what you want. And as a business, there's that enterprise. I have to stay in competition with everyone else around me. So it sort of drives innovation.
Yeah, absolutely. That's, I think, just different attitudes. And it's funny that these attitudes are so much dictated by language and by ecosystem, because I think if you speak to many .NET developers, they have there's a big barrier to actually make a package and put it on NuGet. Some of it is technical, where it's just you have to package it the right way with the right arguments, making sure that all the metadata is correctly and test it. And so there's a big churn to actually produce a package and publish it on NuGet, whereas maybe in other ecosystems it's a bit easier. For instance, Go just references through Git directly, so pushing it to Git is basically publishing. Node is also the tooling is much more geared towards getting it out there fast. And in .NET, I think there's still a bit of a technical challenge to get packages up on NuGet fast. But there's also, I think, a cultural barrier for a lot of folks to where this mental block exists of it's not good enough or it's not ready yet. Whereas sometimes pushing something that's not ready yet, but is 0.1 is totally fine. And you can maybe throw things out sooner and see what sticks, rather than either working too long on something and then finding out that nobody wants it, or you've worked hard on something and then you get burnt out and you never actually share it with the world, which is a shame. So I definitely hope to see more of that as .NET Core progresses and the tooling gets better and easier. So I definitely hope to see that progress in the future.
I totally agree. I mean, there have been times when I've been working on something thinking this is not good enough to release, and then I'll back up my planning notes because I take these meticulous. I feel like I'm not like very many individual open source developers, people who work in teams of one, in that I'll actually plan out what I want to do. I've got a piece of paper, even if it's just a piece of paper with scribbles on it. I want to do this, want to do that, want to do that. And then I'll put a big circle, I'll put MVP. Everything above that is the minimum. That's initial release minimum viable product. Without those features, it's useless. It's pointless having a library that claims to do string concatenation if it doesn't concatenate strings, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's my minimum viable product. And then all of the features after that are individual feature releases. So get it out there, like you said, because you don't know whether what you've just created is actually useful to someone until someone starts using it.
Exactly. And it's funny you mentioned like string concatenation, because I think like I keep on referencing Node.js as a comparison point, but they get often flack for producing like the quote unquote stupidest little packages, like a string concatenation package or the famously the left pet package. Whereas I actually see that as a strength of that ecosystem, where there's just, because the entry to barrier is so low, producing these quote unquote stupid little packages is so easy. It also means that if you actually do need something as what you perceive to be a little feature, it's probably out there. There's probably a package that does that 5-line function that you might have written by yourself or had to think about. So I don't know. I see it actually as the strength of the Node ecosystem, whereas in .NET, you have much less of those little functions, or like it either gets packed up in a big util library, whereas it might have been better just to publish them as 10 tiny little packages. Yeah, but that's definitely like a kind of a bit of a cultural thing within the .NET ecosystem, where if it's not big or grandiose enough, if maybe it's not worth publishing.
Well, you never know. We may see a renaissance of .NET packages now that .NET Core is starting to pick up steam, and when it gets renamed to .NET 5 later this year, it might be that more cross-platform developers who want to create small utility libraries may go, hey, if I just learn I'm not trying to say it's easy to learn how to package something up for NuGet, but like you say, there is that barrier to entry. Once you get past that, you can go, oh, brilliant, I can create 500 tiny NuGet packages that just do this one thing. There may be a number of really useful extension classes for strings or for ints or something, or maybe some conversion classes or something. And I mean, we've seen that with Microsoft anyway. They've split the .NET Core base class libraries and ASP.NET Core and EF Core into hundreds of smaller NuGet packages, such that deployed binaries are then infinitely smaller than a .NET Framework version, because it doesn't require the entirety of the runtime and all of the supporting libraries to install, because you just need to install that one dependency that you have.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a bit of a move in the right direction, in my opinion, at least. That's definitely happening. Although the packages do get, some of ASP.NET now gets deployed through special SDK projects, which is kind of a move in the opposite direction again. But all in the greater scheme of things, they do still exist of those smaller packages, which is a great thing, I guess.
We were going to talk a little bit about Elasticsearch earlier on, and then I sort of diverged us on this other path, talking about .NET and Node.js and Go and all of these wonderful languages. But could you give us a quick, brief introduction into what Elasticsearch is, what it provides, what kind of systems I can run it on? Is it .NET? Is it Node? What can I leverage it with?
Absolutely. Elasticsearch is so many things that just condense, like the elevator pitch for it always does injustice to one big feature or one big use case for it. But in essence, it's a full text search and analytics engines that scales both vertically, obviously, and horizontally quite easily. So you can run many instances on many different nodes and cluster them quite easily. And it's great for many different use cases. So you can run the search for e-commerce sites for it, but you can also use it to store logging, any type of data that's more time series based, such as metrics or logging or errors or any data that's unbounded, basically. Because Elasticsearch scales horizontally, you can always add more nodes. So if you can grow with your data, if you will. The elevator pitch always does injustice to some use cases, but in essence, that's what Elasticsearch provides you with. I personally always started using it as just a straight up search for my SQL databases, basically. So I would quite often build e-commerce sites, and then obviously you need to do things like provide a search page that provides facets on the left side that you can click on. So you can filter by all the blue products and combine it with all the products with size L, for instance. At the same time, it's also great for things like auto-completion. So if you have a search box and you want to do predictive search, Elasticsearch helps you out a great deal there as well. And the nice thing about Elasticsearch is that basically it's one data system that also allows you to plug in your logs from your system as well back into the Elasticsearch, so you can correlate who's doing certain searches and should we maybe optimize our searches for the Dutch demographic differently than for the English demographic, for instance. So like I said, my elevator pitch turned out a bit long, but it's like there's a lot of use cases that it's really, really handy for. It's a great tool to have in your tool belt.
Sure. What I'll do as well is when we were communicating offline, you sent me a video link on YouTube, and I'll make sure to put that in the show notes. So if you want to learn a lot more about Elasticsearch, definitely check the show notes for the YouTube link to a talk that I was linked to. I'll make sure it's in this part of the transcription and in the useful links down at the bottom of the transcription.
Awesome. Yeah.
So you've said it's for any kind of site. You've mentioned SQL. Do I have to have a database, or is it just I create some data in some fashion and give it to Elasticsearch and it will just do its magic?
Yeah, so I haven't touched on the deployment part. So it's basically a Java process. It's its own database, if you want to think of it that way, that you can speak to through a REST API. You deploy it by running a Java process on your hardware. So yeah, if you want to migrate from, or not necessarily migrate, but run Elasticsearch side by side with your Elasticsearch deployment, you can use, for instance, Logstash to send your SQL records over to Elasticsearch so that it can index them and make them available for search. The Logstash is our ETL tooling, which allows you to extract from many different data sources. SQL is one, but it can talk to many, I think over 200 different data sources, and transform it, mutate those events or records or whatever the data source is into the form that you need to, and then load it elsewhere. And Elasticsearch is one of the different outputs for Logstash, but it can emit those things back into, again, I think over 200 different outputs as well. You can obviously also just code it yourself. So we have provide clients for Elasticsearch. That's exactly what my team does. And so you can write a .NET application that reads SQL, creates C# objects for that, and then persist those in Elasticsearch using the Elasticsearch.NET drivers.
So you can use the ETL or extract, transform, load. You can use the ETL tools that are provided by Elasticsearch, or you can indeed write your own, because is there like a schema or something, or a package description? So I know that I have this data in this one format that might be SQL, it might be Mongo, it might be my own data format. As long as I can transform that into whatever Elasticsearch is looking for, I can send it over.
That's a great observation. I'll try to explain why that's a great observation in a second, because by itself, Elasticsearch is schema-less. It's not completely schema-free, but it's schema-less in the sense that you can send any type of JSON to Elasticsearch, and it will infer a schema based on the JSON document that you send to Elasticsearch. So in that sense, it's pretty free form in what type of data it accepts. However, there is a push from within Elastic, and it's publicly available as well, to come up with a sort of a common schema that works well for a lot of different use cases. And something that we call ECS, Elastic Common Schema, and which basically allows you to map your events or any type of time series data. That can be logs, errors, or metrics, or event hop messages, anything that's basically unbounded. And if you map it to this ECS format, then you can create a common format for all of these different data sources, and Elasticsearch will also be able to provide you with better and easier visualizations on top of that. So by itself, Elasticsearch doesn't have a UI. The UI component for the stack is called Kibana, which is a Node.js application that you can run, and which basically acts as the BI tool for Elasticsearch as well. So it allows you to create visualizations on top of the data that you store in Elasticsearch.
That's really interesting then, that it's sort of being schemaless, it infers a schema. So there must be some kind of very intelligent, almost like reflection going on there to figure out what this data is and how it's all related, if it is indeed related. Does it have to be relational data, or can I just give it, here is a JSON blob or whatever, BSON blob or something, here is another one, and here is another one, and they are not related in the slightest?
They are not related in the slightest. So Elasticsearch is not relational at all. So you basically store data denormalized into Elasticsearch. So the document that you store in Elasticsearch should have all of the information inside of it that you want to use to find it. So you cannot create relations between different documents as well. So Elasticsearch is really fast, but it's fast because it basically pre-computes all of the answers for you at indexation time rather than at query time. Yeah, so if you want to persist your data into Elasticsearch, you have to do a form of denormalization. So that in terms of, for instance, in .NET, that means creating the whole object graph and storing that object as a single document in Elasticsearch.
In the same way that static sites are always going to be faster than any kind of server-based web application, non-relational, flat, normalized data will always be quicker to query than data that has 400 tables and everything is linked via foreign keys and sometimes a foreign key link table, and it all gets a bit confusing, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So for most cases, Elasticsearch just acts as something that you run side by side next to an existing data source that does have the guarantees that you want to have. So if you need ACID or if you need transactions over multiple records, then you would need another data system next to Elasticsearch.
I've read somewhere that I can just point the output of a static site generator that, as long as it creates some kind of data set, I can use that with Elasticsearch and similar things to provide a search-like functionality on a website that doesn't have a server. Is that correct? Am I in the right direction there? I don't know whether what I've read is true, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, so Elasticsearch is part of the whole product suite that Elastic provides. And part of that suite is also a component that's called Site Search, which is a SaaS offering that allows you to basically scan and scroll your website for you and provide a site search bar on your site without having to install anything server-side component. So we definitely offer this component as well, but it's not yet something that you can run on your own machine. So it's a SaaS. That's purely a SaaS offering for now.
Okay, that's fair enough. I mean, search is hard anyway, and if I can offload that to someone else to do.
Absolutely, yeah. And obviously the site search will try to do a lot of smart things with ranking, provide you with the most relevant pages if you're looking for data on your site.
You mentioned it just now that there is a .NET client library for Elasticsearch, so I don't have to point at some esoteric web endpoint. I could just call this API, presumably in my .NET code, and it will do whatever is required to talk to the endpoint. But you did mention off air that it was one of the first things to be released for, and I'm going to use a phrase that I don't think many listeners will know what it means, DNX, which was the long-term evolution of .NET before it was called .NET Core.
Yeah, definitely one of the first to release packages for DNX, which is, I'm not sure if that's still it was either called DNX or ASP.NET 5. I think those terms were used interchangeably. Yeah, I think that's one of the precursors that David Fowler and his team built before .NET Core really took off, which for me at the time I was super excited to see. It was already trying to implement cross-platform .NET, cross-platform tooling, command line tooling, and it was basically a completely new runtime with new JSON-based project files and with NuGet support for loading these packages as well. And so our client was one of the first packages to adopt this as well. And we've been on that .NET Core train ever since. And that's purely because I think .NET Core is one of the biggest things to have happened in .NET. And it might have been, in a way, it's saving grace. Like, it's a viable option now again for anybody that's a Linux person or an OS X person. And at the time of DNX, I was using OS X as my main development machine. And now I'm on Linux. And thanks to the advent of .NET Core and in many ways, OmniSharp and Rider, like the experience is just so fantastic. I kind of have to confess that I think the last time I've opened Visual Studio might have been 2 years ago, which is kind of crazy.
We'll come back to the Elasticsearch NuGet library in a moment, but just the ability to have these C# files and do .NET build on a machine, on a USB, unplug the USB device, plug it into someone else's machine, and just run it on that machine. I'm running Mac OS, they're running Windows. Just that ability to just do that it's mind-blowing. It's something that Java has promised for a long time, and Java did deliver on that. I think I was in the same boat as you. I was running OS X on my MacBook Air when .NET Core was first announced. Before then, I was trying to figure out how to do .NET-based development on a non-Windows machine, and I think I've got a blog post somewhere in the history of all the things I've ever written, all about using GTK Sharp and Mono Develop and all this kind of stuff to create a small binary that I could just run. And I think the target was, I had a backup of all of my SMS text messages from my phone in an XML format, and there were duplicates, and I just wanted to use C# and .NET to load them in with this common schema, group them by conversations, and then remove all of the duplicates. That's all I wanted to do, and it took me about 5 hours just to figure out how to compile it and build it and run it on my OS X machine. And now that same code, I just do .NET Run, and here it is. I'm currently sitting in front of a Windows machine, but my desktop is a Linux PC, and that same MacBook Air has survived this long, so I still use that too, and I could just run it. It's amazing.
Yeah, I think for me, that whole movement of DNX and OmniSharp has really kept me on .NET, because at the time, just seeing how agile or like how fast you can prototype IDs in Python or Ruby or like other languages is basically you create the file and you point Python or Ruby to it and it runs it. In that sense, I think .NET can still do better. Like we still have project files and solution files that are pretty archaic. So if you come to .NET completely fresh, then CS project files and solution files look completely dumb. But we're in such a good state now with the .NET Core CLI and just .NET being able to run a project from the command line without ever opening an IDE or anything like that is just great.
It really is. And like you say, that barrier to entry for Python and Ruby and Go and JavaScript is just so low that you just create a file and point the runtime or compiler or your tooling at it, and it just works. And I think we'll get there with C#. I think so. At the moment, I do know that on Windows you can just invoke the C# compiler if you have a single file or a number of files. But the problem with that is that the call to that command gets a bit massive.
Yeah, CSC is not for the faint of heart, I guess. That could be easier if you can just say .NET myclass.cs and it will just, or program.cs and it would just run. But yeah, maybe in the future, or we can create CSX files and then graduate from CSX files to C# files. Similarly, that you can, for instance, now do with F#, just prototype in FSX files, and then if you want to make it compilable, something with artifacts, then you just switch over to F# script files. So, but having said that, even if that's not the case now or not the case in 2 years, I think that where we're at right now is just amazing. Personally, on a personal level, found my joy with .NET again because of all this push that has been happening to create a cross-platform environment and the runtime available everywhere. And yeah, even though there's so many things that you might still want, such as ahead of time compilation and like even smaller binaries, it's just fantastic where we are at right now. Do think I'd much rather create binaries in .NET than I do in Go. I can waffle on about this for a long time, but yeah, with Go it's great to write system tooling, and then you get this 20 megabyte file that you can run anywhere. We're not there quite yet with .NET either, but yeah, we're definitely not far off either. So yeah,
that's true. Like you say, with the ahead of time compilation and the rather than having it cross-platform, you can target a specific platform, reduces the file size. And I think I saw a wonderful blog post only a few days ago where the author of the blog post had written the classic 2D game Snake. He'd written that in C# as a .NET binary and gotten the executable binary down to 8 kilobytes.
Yeah, I saw the blog post in amazement. Just the fact that it's possible instills me with so much hope and joy. It's crazy. Yeah,
it was a feat of technical engineering, I think. I read that blog post and was like, I understand about 60% of this.
That's way more than I claim to understand.
You and your colleagues have worked on the Elasticsearch.net client. Has there been, aside from the project JSON, which we tend not to talk about, What has that evolution been for you as a library creator, as someone who creates some software that will use this new technology? What has that journey been like?
I think at the time it felt a bit rough. I think that looking back, I paint a bit of a rosier picture in my head. I mean, it was okay. I think the biggest issue, and I still think, is the notion of TFMs and producing libraries that have to be loaded in different runtimes. I think that's the hardest thing to wrap your head around as a library author. So, okay, I build a package for .NET Standard 1.1. What does it mean? Where can it be loaded? And .NET Standard is already fantastic because prior to that we had PCL profiles, and then I think it was PCL 168, I believe. There was the magic profile that had the most environments that the DLL could be loaded through NuGet. I think that's still a bit of a hairy spot for the .NET ecosystem. So just a constant, okay, building .NET Standard 2.0 packages in my NuGet package. Okay, but then NuGet has a bug, so I need to also to create .NET 4.6.1 packages for people that are on older versions of NuGet. There's a lot of knowledge that you need to have as a library author that I think you shouldn't have. And even now with .NET Standard, ideally you'd just be able to build packages for a .NET Standard, but that's not necessarily always the case because the .NET Core is moving along faster than .NET Standard. So you might quite often have to build .NET Core specific packages as well. And so this makes sense to me or to any .NET developer, but somebody who comes in blank, wants to do .NET and then is faced with packaging a project, it's a bit daunting, I would say still. And even for me as somebody who's had a NuGet package for I think 8 or 9 years now, it's a bit of a hassle to keep up with as well, to know exactly what the pitfalls are with packaging a project. And being on the bleeding edge, you cannot complain. So obviously the DNX tooling had rough edges and the .NET Core tooling had rough edges, but in the end, it's all been worth it. And if you're on the bleeding edge and you get caught, I don't think you should be standing on a soapbox and start shouting that something is rough. That's what you sign up for if you're on the bleeding edge. And like I said, the place where we are right now with .NET is just any kind of hassle has been worth it.
I tend to agree with you there. Although I've created a number of smaller libraries for ASP.NET Core specific, so I think up until 2.1 you could still use them with .NET Framework. There was a stepping stone build, I believe, where you can still run ASP.NET Core on top of .NET Framework for a little while, whilst .NET Core 2.1 and 2.2 are still supported, to allow people to sort of slowly migrate things over, because there's a little bit of work involved. ASP.NET and ASP.NET Core are two completely different beasts, so allowing that support. But I haven't created anything big, and I haven't created a lot of stuff, and it hasn't lived for very long. So I can't really comment myself about the tooling other than, like I said, the Project JSON stuff was a bit rough. And like I said, we try not to talk about that.
Yeah, exactly. I think any horror stories from that scouring for the right versions and combination of versions, I think belongs in the past. It's no use of digging up old source like that, especially since it's not actually relevant to this day and age.
You've done a lot of open source development that I can see that worked on OmniSharp, Editor Config, a number of different really high profile things. Like, I wouldn't say that OmniSharp is a library, but I feel like it is. The first question is, for the folks who don't realize that when they fire up Visual Studio Code for the first time and it installs OmniSharp, what's actually being installed? What's going on there?
Yeah, so the OmniSharp project is something that Jason Emerson started because he needed something for Vim out of process, because Vim script itself is blocking. So if anything you do that's heavily processed will lock up the editor. So he created OmniSharp basically as an out of process brain, if you will, for .NET. And from that, the effort, and with Roslyn obviously being released, it became quite easy to tack on more editor implementations on the OmniSharp server that Jason Emerson had built. And so my involvement with OmniSharp is quite limited and I haven't done that much since. I initially started the Atom integration I was still looking for a nice editor that I could use. And although I do quite like Vim, and I just started playing with Atom, so I just tried it out and see what the integration there looked like. And I think I created the website and the logo for it, and that's about it. But I have to confess, as soon as Rider was released, I gave up development on OmniSharp just because, Rider did everything that I wanted and more. Yeah, and so the other tool that I've built is Editor Config. Again, is an existing effort that I joined. where there was already an editor config Visual Studio plugin, and I just joined the open source project to help out and took over ownership of that. Then I also created a port of the C++ parser that was at the heart of the editor config for most implementations. And I did that to actually being able to, editor config is basically a file that you can put in your projects and have a common set of conventions for your files, basically. So files should use tabs, or they use spaces, they should use spaces with an indent size of 2 or 4. And then you can configure that based on file patterns and dictate the conventions that each file should use. And I'm a big proponent of tabs, and that's not the default in .NET. Like if Visual Studio, if you do file new project, you get spaces. Mm-hmm. So obviously I wanted to encode that, okay, all the files should be tabs, and I think editor config is a great way to do that. And so that's how I got involved in that project. But then it's just fun to see how things can find a place. So I wrote the editor config core C# port because the Visual Studio plugin was relying on the C++ DLLs, which were a little bit hard to build, especially cross-platform, because they heavily relied on the Visual Studio make files. And so I wrote the C# port for that, just to be able to have an easier deployment with Visual Studio plugins, which are not easy to build in their own right. And then that found its way into ReSharper and Rider. And now every time you open a file in either ReSharper or Rider, you go through that little thing that I wrote. And that's kind of pointing back to the first thing that I mentioned in this podcast, is that I debated quite a bit, like, should I even put it online? Like, is this useful to anybody else but me? Because I have this isolated use case for it. And then it found like a heavy other use case for it as well. So now I'm super happy that I put it online and actually took the time to package it properly, etc. That's just the fun of open source. Like, you never know who's going to use it, how they're going to use it. And I think that doesn't get old for me.
That is interesting. This, I don't want to say throwaway idea, but this idea that you had, I mean, I believe GitHub has support for it too. You know, if you commit, it can make little comments on the GitHub UI as well. So
yeah,
this one idea that you had has been largely adopted by, like you said, Rider and Visual Studio and all of these tools that almost anyone can use.
Yeah, I can't claim to have invented the editor config file format, but it's a fantastic effort across many different ecosystems, and the level of adoption in tooling, and like you say, GitHub has support for it, and any editor nowadays has support for it. So it's amazing to have seen that grown. Whereas in the beginning, like one of the things I wanted to push to OmniSharp and Roslyn was to actually introduce editor config support. And then while I was working on the PR for editor config support in Roslyn, I found out that they had already internally built editor config and support in Roslyn. So sadly not using my package, but that's totally fine. Like it's there. Like now you can format your C# files completely with editor config with support from the compiler. It's just awesome.
Excellent. You see, I guess it just shows that anyone can have an idea, and especially if it's open source, anyone can contribute to that idea and make it better.
Yeah, absolutely. And join existing efforts as well.
So what about some of your other .NET tooling that you're working on? Did you want to talk about those?
Yeah, so part of the reason why I'm doing this podcast is to draw attention also to some of the tools that we're hopefully going to release soon, which is the .NET tools. So we're going to publish a assembly differ project, which basically allows you to create a diff between two different packages, then just easily glance whether they contain breaking changes. So obviously you can use this for many different purposes. One of them would be that in CI or in pull request that you can fill the build if a pull request will start to create breaking changes. So that's definitely something that we want to release this month. It's called assembly differ. And it's based on just decompile and just assembly. That's another thing. We created this tool, and then I created the pull request back to just decompile and just assembly. And now, because of that, I'm in contact with the original author of those two, Shvatko Jovchev, and we're gonna hopefully work together now to get assembly differ, into a state that we both wanted. Basically, what we did was repackage those and making sure that you can pull down NuGet packages and pick the right DLLs from those NuGet packages. And then while speaking with Shvatko, like that was one of the original intentions of the two DLLs, just decompile and just assembly, but they just never got around to actually finishing that part of those two amazing libraries. And so he was quite happy to see that actually taking shape. And now we're kind of hopefully working together to finish that off this month to release. So again, you do stuff out in the open. You get in contact with amazing people like that. And the other tool that we're going to release is Assembly Rewriter, which allows you to rewrite DLLs. So it allows you to internalize DLLs and then rewrite their namespaces. This is something that we've used in the .NET client for Elasticsearch in the version 6. Because one of the I wouldn't say biggest problems that we had, but it's one of the most common problems that we had is that we shipped the .NET client with a dependency on JSON.NET version, say, 8. And then JSON.NET releases a major new version 9. And then because we tend to update fast, we also update our package. But even though we probably update maybe a week or two later, we get an issue. The first issue that we get after JSON.NET released their new major version was, please update your dependency to the latest JSON.NET. And so we follow along, and then we update our NuGet package dependency. And then as soon as we upgraded our dependency to the latest major version, 2 new tickets would be created saying, please downgrade your JSON.NET major version dependency because we're not ready to go to JSON.NET 9 yet. And so with the tool Assembly Rewriter that we have there, is basically allowed us to internalize JSON.NET into our own DLL and rewrite its namespace. So it would be, I don't know, I think we rewrote it to elastic.json.net or something like that. So and internalize all of those types. So we could actually still use JSON.NET, but package it in such a way that it's completely hidden to our users. So we don't have the NuGet package dependency on JSON.NET anymore. That's a tool that we've used for, I think, 2 years, and I'm very keen to get out there because I hope it could be useful to other library authors as well. And the last one that we want to release is something that we've used for years and has saved our butt quite a few times, is an assembly validator where call NuGet pack, or in the olden days, NuGet.execpack, and then you get these NuGet packages. But then these NuGet packages create DLLs, and they're signed, and they contain version numbers. How are you certain that they contain the right version numbers and they are signed with the right key? And so we have this tool that basically unpacks the NuGet packages and then introspects the DLLs to say, okay, is this actually signed? Are we going to publish this NuGet package with the signature that we, basically the assembly identity that we expect to publish with? And so I'm very much looking forward to getting these 3 little .NET tools out there so that they get a bit more wider use as well.
What I want to say about these is they seem very useful. The last one that we talked about, the assembly differ and the assembly validator. I don't want to pressure everyone to using them, but they or something like them should be used in everyone's CI/CD pipeline, right? Because otherwise, how do you know that the assemblies you're loading in have not been tampered with?
Yeah, exactly. Or it's quite easy to forget to build in release mode or build the DLLs with the wrong versions.
Or maybe using an old signing key or something.
Exactly, yeah.
And I must say, I have come across an issue where I would have loved to have used Assembly Rewriter. It was a few years ago. I was working on a project. The team that I was on had built this project for a year or so. We needed some new functionality, and one of the members of the team went, hey, there's a NuGet package for that. So I went, okay, I inspect the NuGet package. It looks good. Fine, let's pull it into the project, and I'll do a spike, do some work in progress, some experiments to see if I can get it working. And I couldn't because they'd used the same namespace as we had.
Wow, yeah.
So we got all these namespace collisions somewhere, and they couldn't pull in this code and that code because do you mean this namespace over here or that namespace over there? And we'd used British English spellings, and the NuGet author had used American spellings, so there was a Z in there somewhere, so that helped, but not for a human reader. If you're looking through and you're, oh, right, okay, so why has somebody misspelled our internal namespace? Do I need to go back and change that? No, we've unfortunately had to pull this NuGet package in, which has the same namespace. Now, it was open source, so we could have just forked the code, renamed the namespaces, and put in a little notice inside the app. This uses a forked and altered version of the software. We told that to legal, and they effectively pulled their hair out and said, no, you can't do that.
It's crazy, yeah. I apologize because with these toolings, like what I mentioned earlier, is where I wish people would throw things over the wall earlier and see what sticks. And I completely did not eat my own dogma here, where these tools have been lingering for way too long. And hopefully, like yourself, they will find a use case in somebody's CI pipeline as well. Yeah.
Are these open source tools? Are they closed source tools?
They're open source. They're currently under the Nulian GitHub organization. I'm sure we'll provide links towards.
Yeah, sure. I can get the links to those.
Yeah, they're not on NuGet.org yet, but that's what I'm hoping to accomplish this month for sure.
And do you take pull requests for these? So if someone looks at it and goes, oh, I can change this, or I've spotted an issue and I can fix it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So thank you for raising that, because I welcome everybody to hammer away on those. Absolutely.
They're open source, but are they free to use? Because obviously there's a difference between open source software and free open source software, isn't there? So can I just pull down the code, hit compile, pull out an exe or something and throw it at my CI/CD pipeline and not have to worry? Or is there some kind of licensing?
No, everything is Apache 2 licensed, so they're free and open source tools. Yeah.
Okay, so there's really no argument for not using them then.
No, that's true. That is a good segue back into Elastic Land, maybe, because something I haven't mentioned with Elasticsearch is that it's also open source and completely free to use. So we do have a licensed proprietary version as well, where some features in Elasticsearch require you to have a license. But with that said, Elasticsearch itself is open. Even the proprietary features are on GitHub, but to actually use them, you will need the appropriate license for them. And so that sometimes creates some little bit of confusion, because the default distribution that you download from Elasticsearch might have these proprietary bits in, even though they don't necessarily get activated if you don't have the right license. And so we also, with Elastic, if that's a concern, we also ship a completely open source distribution as well that doesn't contain any of those proprietary bits in.
That's incredibly useful to know, yeah, because on the one hand, we all have to make a little money to pay our bills and make sure that we eat. But it's also nice to know that there's a free-to-use open source version of the tool that I can sort of dip my toes in. And if it sounds like I'm going to use the proprietary features, then yeah, I can fling some money towards yourselves and pay for the license for those proprietary parts of the system, I suppose.
Absolutely. And so I encourage everybody to check out Elasticsearch as well, because it's such a great tool. And even the open source version contains so many great features. I would say like the features that typically get pushed into the paid versions are more enterprisey features. So if you're looking to really write something, if you want to do something functionally with Elasticsearch, typically it will be available in the open source or basic versions of Elasticsearch.
So if I want to learn about Elasticsearch, I can go to, is it elasticsearch.co? Is that the best place to find it?
Yeah, that's a perfect starting point to start your Elastic journey. Yeah.
Okay. And what about these tools that you've mentioned? Is there a website for those, or is it just check out GitHub for now?
Yeah.
Are there plans to be a website?
There won't be a website for those. There will just be a GitHub, but they're all under a common organization called Nulian, which the link will be provided as well.
Sure, yeah, I'll make sure to put those in the show notes. I mean, we've talked a lot about open source, right? So what are your main reasons, I guess, for being in open source development? Because, there's a lot of people are turned off by it because if it's open source, then it's free, then I can't make any money. But you seem to be very excited about making stuff open source for people to use. What's your top, maybe 2 or 3 reasons for doing that then?
They're completely selfish reasons. It's, you do meet a lot of fantastic people just by putting yourself out there or your code out there, which I don't know which one of the two is scarier, but you do meet a lot of really nice people. And the way I started in open source, it was before GitHub, before any of those sites were available. There was I started scripting in MIRC, which is like a jet program for Windows, and it came with this little scripting engine. And around it, amazingly, there was a big community that formed around it, and there had multiple sites to deal with publishing scripts and showing screenshots about what you did, and people would reply to it, and you would get feedback, and they would say, have you tried doing something differently? If you do it this way, it's going to be faster. So for me, that was also like accelerated learning for me as well, whereas like I learned about regular expressions and DLLs and COM and all these different things that the normal like 13-year-old would never actually find just because you were talking to the right people online. And I think that promise of open source is still there. And especially nowadays when you have GitHub and others as well, where getting feedback on what you throw out there, it's not always going to be nice and friendly, but you're going to get some form of feedback, I think has kept me going as well.
So folks should be definitely checking out your open source projects, even if it's the assembly rewriter, assembly differ, assembly validator. But they should also definitely check out Elasticsearch.
Yeah, exactly. The wider .NET team within Elastic are also working on and have shipped already a .NET APM agent for that allows you to monitor your running application. So you can visualize how well your application is performing inside of Elasticsearch and Kibana. So definitely check that out as well. And we're going to start shipping a lot of more integrations with the common schema that I've mentioned earlier as well for the stack. So we're going to ship with log formatters that emit log messages in ECS format and allow you to ship that data into Elasticsearch easier as well. That's all open source as well. And then hopefully we can provide a link at the end of this podcast as well for those.
So yeah, definitely check through the show notes for some links. So then it seems as though a lot of your work, at least at the moment, is going into, I hate to use the term because people are going to think it's a job title, but DevOpsy type stuff, the CI/CD stuff, platform monitoring, getting logs, all of that kind of stuff. It seems very DevOpsy. Is this something that you would recommend everyone look into, or is it more a case of me and my friends or my colleagues are building these tools, so you don't have to? Is that which way around is it? Would you say?
Oh yeah, I think it's both. Both definitely. Like the APM agent for Elastic APM agent for .NET is easy to install, and if you run it and you have a running Elasticsearch instance or APM server to point it to, it really takes a lot of the work out of your hands. So you can start monitoring your SQL queries, how well your controllers perform, etc. So and more integrations are definitely to follow there, and so. But a lot of it is definitely geared toward DevOpsy stuff.
Where can folks go to find out a lot more about you? Like, what's the best way to find out about Martijn's work, what you're getting on with, the projects you're working on, that kind of stuff? Where's the best place to find that at?
I guess I'm on Twitter. That's where you can follow me. So I put myself out there not so much for myself, more so for the project. So I don't really have a landing page or like even my blog post. I think the last blog post I written is 4 years ago or 5 years ago.
Okay, no, that's a perfectly valid answer, But okay, so in that case, where do I want to go if I want to learn about all the different projects then? So Elastic, the APM stuff for Elastic, Kibana, all that kind of stuff, the assembly rewriters and all that kind of stuff. There won't be one common place, but is it like elastic.co and GitHub and stuff like that? Is that the best way to do it?
Yeah, exactly. So for the .NET specific integrations, there's a single landing page on the elastic.co site, which is actually a great idea that I should circle internally as well. But the different integrations exist as part of different products. And so the information for the actual integrations will be part of the product pages on the elastic.co site. Definitely check those out. And yeah, for the tooling, everything is on GitHub as well. So if you've which is part of the Nullian organization on GitHub.
What I'll do is I'll make sure to collect a whole bunch of links from you, and I'll put them in the show notes. So yeah, whatever you're listening to this episode on, make sure you click through, scroll down to the bottom, and all of those links will be there, and you'll be able to click through and learn about Elastic and all the different things that Elastic can do, and all the assembly rewriters, the differs, and the validators and things like that. We used a lot of acronyms and technical terms that some folks may not know about, so I'll make sure to put some links to some of those in there as well, in case you don't know what a TFM, which is a Target Framework Moniker, is, or in case you don't know what application monitoring is, that kind of thing. I'll put some links in there just to sort of help with providing some of the background information if folks don't know it.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
All that really remains to say is check out Martijn's open source stuff. Definitely check the links in the show notes to get those. And thank you ever so much, Martijn, for taking the time out to talk to me. I've really honestly enjoyed it, and I've learned so much more about open source stuff, DevOpsy things, and a little bit more about how my editors of choice work. It's absolutely wonderful. Thank you ever so much.
Thanks for having me, Jamie. Thanks.
Thank you. That was my interview with Martijn Laarman. Be sure to check out the show notes for a bunch of links to some of the stuff we covered and a full transcription of the interview. The show notes, as always, can be found at .netcore.show, and there will be a link directly to them in your podcatcher. And don't forget to spread the word. Leave me a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice. Head over to dotnetcore.show/subscribe for ways to do that, and to come back next time for more .NET Core goodness. I'll see you again real soon. See you later, folks. The .NET Core podcast is a production of RJJ Software Limited.